There's a jar sitting on a wooden shelf in a barn somewhere in rural Ohio. It has no brand name on it, no warranty card, no barcode. It was filled with a handful of salt, a splash of water, and 2 pieces of scrap metal that cost almost nothing. And right now, at this very moment, it is producing electricity. It has been producing electricity since before your parents were born. The company that was supposed to replace it went bankrupt. The technology that was supposed to make it obsolete is already in your recycling bin. And the people who built it never spent a single dollar on a battery after that first afternoon. If you have ever wondered why every battery you buy seems to die just a few months after the warranty runs out, stay with me, because the answer has been sitting in an Amish barn for nearly a century, and what you are about to hear is going to change the way you think about energy, self-reliance, and who actually controls your power. This is NexReveal, where we dig beneath the surface of what mainstream culture calls settled and find what has quietly been allowed to disappear. And today we are going deep into a story that crosses chemistry, history, community independence, and one of the most quietly consequential decisions ever made inside an American boardroom. To understand how a farming community in Ohio ended up holding knowledge that major corporations spent decades trying to make irrelevant, you have to go back further than most people expect. Long before lithium, long before alkaline, long before the corner store battery rack existed, the science of converting chemical reactions into usable electricity was already well understood. Electrochemical cells, what we now loosely call batteries, were documented in serious scientific literature as early as the 1790s. Alessandro Volta in northern Italy demonstrated that stacking alternating discs of zinc and copper separated by cloth soaked in brine produced a continuous electrical current. He called it the Voltic pile. The world called it a miracle. What almost nobody discusses today is that his materials cost almost nothing, that brine is simply salt water, and that the core principle he demonstrated has never stopped working. Not once. Not for a single day in over 2 centuries. The question was never whether the chemistry worked. The question, as it always turns out to be, was who would profit from packaging it. Throughout the 1800s, wet cell batteries powered telegraph networks across entire continents. They sat in wooden boxes in railroad stations. They hummed quietly beneath the floors of early telephone exchanges. Rural communities across America used homemade versions to power doorbells, to charge small accumulators, to run the occasional signal lamp. The materials were local, the knowledge was common, and the maintenance was something any careful person could manage. Then, gradually, systematically, that common knowledge began to disappear, not because it failed, not because something better came along in any meaningful sense, but because the industrial model that replaced it depended on one thing the old wet cell could never provide: a customer who had to come back. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, and this is the part that the Amish understood before almost anyone else did. When rural electrification programs expanded across the United States through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, most farming communities made a straightforward choice. They connected to the grid because the grid was convenient, it was subsidized, and it arrived with the quiet assumption that this was simply the modern way. But a subset of communities across Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio, looked at that offer and made a different calculation entirely. They were not rejecting technology out of stubbornness. They were rejecting dependency. They saw the monthly bill as a permanent leash, and they understood something that almost no one in a consumer culture wants to admit. A system you cannot maintain yourself is a system that owns you. So they kept building their own cells, and in keeping that practice alive, they preserved something that the wider American public quietly lost. The electrochemistry behind a saltwater battery is not complicated. You take 2 metals with different positions on what chemists call the electrochemical reactivity series. One metal gives up electrons more readily than the other. When both are placed inside a conductive liquid, an electrolyte, the more reactive metal begins to release electrons. Those electrons travel through an external wire toward the less reactive metal. And that movement of electrons is an electrical current. The salt in the water is not the power source. It is the enabler. Salt ions make the water conductive, allowing the chemical exchange between the metals to sustain itself. The specific metals matter enormously. The concentration of salt matters. The size and surface area of the metal plates matter. And there are specific additions to the electrolyte solution, known within these communities and almost nowhere else, that dramatically extend the operating life of each cell. We will come to those in a moment. But the core of the process is so straightforward that a student with 1 semester of a chemistry behind them could follow it without any difficulty. This is not obscure knowledge. This is foundational knowledge that has been allowed to drift out of common circulation because common circulation was no longer commercially useful. If you are finding this conversation valuable and you want to understand more about the systems and techniques that quietly disappeared from everyday life, NexReveal is the channel where that investigation never stops. Subscribe now, because what comes in the next few minutes is the specific part of this story that almost no one outside of a handful of rural Ohio communities has ever heard told in plain language. The longevity problem is where this story gets genuinely fascinating. Most people who have attempted homemade saltwater cells report that they work for a few weeks, and then the output degrades and eventually stops. The conventional explanation is that the metals corrode, the electrolyte becomes contaminated, and the chemistry eventually reaches equilibrium and stalls. And that conventional explanation is partially correct. But it misses the central variable that separates a cell that runs for 3 weeks from a cell that runs for 30 years. The problem that kills most homemade cells is not corrosion in the general sense. It is a specific electrochemical phenomenon in which microscopic metallic structures begin to grow through the electrolyte between the two electrodes. Over time, these structures can bridge the gap between the metals and cause an internal short circuit that kills the cell entirely. Industrial battery manufacturers address this with expensive engineered separators and proprietary chemical additives. The Amish communities in Holmes County address it with something that has been in every kitchen in the world for thousands of years. A small measured addition of dilute acid to the electrolyte solution slightly shifts the chemical environment inside the cell in a way that dramatically slows the growth of these destructive structures. The cells that communities in this region have maintained and documented over multiple generations show operational lifespans that would seem impossible to anyone who has only worked with commercial batteries. But they are not impossible. They are simply the result of having the correct recipe and actually following it generation after generation, because there was no alternative you could go to the store and buy instead. The temperature question is the second half of this equation, and it is one of the most elegantly simple engineering insights in the entire story. Heat accelerates almost every chemical reaction, including the ones that degrade a battery cell. A cell operating in a hot garage in July is aging many times faster than the same cell kept in a cool, stable environment. The communities that built these long-lived systems did not stumble onto temperature management accidentally. They buried their larger storage cells. Underground, at a depth of around 3 feet, the ground temperature across most of the central and eastern United States stays remarkably stable across the entire year, hovering in a range that is ideal for electrochemical storage. No refrigeration unit, no climate control system, just Earth, which has been doing this job for longer than any of us can calculate. What you end up with, when you combine the correct metals, the right electrolyte concentration, the specific additives that the community figured out through decades of careful observation, and the passive temperature management of simple underground placement, is a power storage system with a functional lifespan measured not in product cycles but in human generations. Here is what this means for you in practical terms, and this is the part of the conversation I want you to sit with. The materials required to build a functional saltwater cell that will produce usable voltage for emergency lighting, small radio operation, device charging, or low current applications are available at any hardware store, any grocery store, and possibly already in your home. The chemistry is legal, safe when handled with basic common sense, and completely within the ability of any careful adult to manage. The maintenance involved is minimal, consisting of periodic water replenishment and occasional inspection of the metal electrodes. The total material cost for a small bank of cells capable of powering an LED light circuit is well under $40, and most of those materials will last for years before they need replacing. What you're not getting from that $40 investment is unlimited power for heavy appliances. That is not what this technology was designed for, and it is not what it does. What you are getting is independence from a portion of your energy dependency. You are getting a backup system that has no software to corrupt, no proprietary charger to lose, no recycling program to navigate when it eventually wears out. You are getting something you can repair with your own hands, explain to your children, and pass on in functional condition. The communities that preserved this knowledge did not do so because they had no other options. They did so because they made a deliberate choice about what kind of relationship they wanted to have with the systems that sustain their daily lives. That choice looks increasingly wise from where the rest of us are standing. There is a version of the next 20 years in which ordinary households have no meaningful understanding of where their energy comes from, how it is stored, or what they would do if it became unavailable or unaffordable. NexReveal exists because that question has not yet been answered. Subscribe and keep watching. The next piece of this puzzle is closer than you think.